Over to you, brother.
Thanks, Jason. My name's Tim. I'm an alcoholic. I'm also a member of Al-Anon. So we covered last week. Good morning, everyone. If I get to see a few more cameras, it would help. It helps to have some, to see the faces of the people that I'm addressing, trying to communicate with. Um, so we've covered the first 11 steps. We've covered having had a spiritual awakening last week. So now we're on to this question of carrying the message and practicing these principles in all our affairs. And I've got some notes, but I'm very minded to completely ignore them. Um, uh, this week I was talking to a sponsee in another fellowship, and not AA or Al-Anon, and they were saying that their sponsee had, as it were, given the program, had done the 12 steps, and given the program a break for 3 or 4 months. They hadn't been in contact for 3 or 4 months. And they've turned back up again because everything, I think the technical term is everything had turned to shit. Um, and so what they decided, they got back in touch with their sponsor and said, I want to work the steps again. I think I should do the steps. And that sounds very good, doesn't it? Doing the steps, well, that must be the answer to the problem, mustn't it? Um, and it's a very it's a very common phenomenon in the world of recovery for people uh, to do the first 11 steps, but to do them in order to make themselves feel better and miss the point of the whole thing, which is to literally restructure your life, your day, so that it's built around serving God, not serving self. It involves adopting an entirely different uh, belief system and value system, and then actually literally living in accordance with it. Doesn't mean one doesn't have a job and a house and all those things, but you get the point. It's on a completely different basis. It's not the same thing, but just with a little uh, golden shine to it. It's fundamentally different. It talks in Bill's story about his roots grasped new soil. Um, the first 11 steps are like, and even that part of the 12th step where it says we having had a spiritual awakening as the result of these steps, those are, as it were, preparing a meal, but they don't satisfy hunger. The hunger is satisfied by taking the second and third parts of step 12, which is to carry this message and to practice these principles in all our affairs. So to test whether a person has got the point of the steps, one can go through the steps and not get the point of it, completely miss the point of it. Is look at what the person is doing. Look at what I can look at what I am doing. Uh, am I sponsoring people? If I've had times when I've had fewer sponsees, am I spending the time I would have spent sponsoring people, going to meetings, carrying the message, um, uh, um, maintaining and developing relationships with people who are new and struggling in order to place myself in a position where I can sponsor? Am I sharing in meetings and in the many other ways there are to share? For example, I'm a member of some WhatsApp groups where readings get posted every day, sometimes from the literature, sometimes from other sources. And some of these groups, there's one of the Al-Anon ones has got like 250 people on it. And everyone is encouraged to respond to the reading of the day by sharing experience, strength, and hope. Very often, no one responds to the message. So that's 250 examples of being offered an opportunity to carry the message and not carrying. Amazing. It's amazing, actually, when you consider um, that the point of the program is to forge oneself into a link in a chain of message carrying from God to people who are still suffering. And I certainly, when I got into recovery, saw myself as a customer and AA as the service provider. And that's not what it's about. I'm to become part of AA. So other ways of carrying the message to professionals, so through the service structure chiefly, but also informally, carrying the message to still suffering alcoholics, that's also through the service structure, but still individually that's possible. And also the welter of activities which are there to support that. So being a GSR, you're helping to support the service structure. Lots of jobs at Intergroup, being the secretary of Intergroup enables, it isn't 12-step work, but it enables 12-step work. To go back to the point, the test of whether the first 11 steps have had any effect whatsoever is very, very simple. Look at your schedule going forward and look at the 24 hours that have passed. How much of that was spent carrying the message or helping the message to be carried? And the schedule doesn't lie. If one discovers that one is doing little or nothing in that regard, the job is not to redo the first 11 steps, I don't think. I think the job is to, as it were, eat the meal that you've prepared. Now, it might have gone a bit cold, but it can be popped in the microwave, heated up pretty quickly, and you'll have a piping hot meal in 5 minutes. So, what does that look like? If a person's program is foundering, I think one starts at step 12. Typically, if someone has done the steps, they've got an awful lot of knowledge and experience, which is simply waiting to be deployed. If you go to a meeting of AA with that information and experience, even if you're terribly rusty, and you say to God, right, here is a meeting, here is an opportunity to contribute before, during, and after. Show me how. God will show you how. And it comes back very, very quickly. I had a break. I sort of dive bombed AA for a couple of years and made occasional guest appearances. This was over 20 years ago. Over 20 years ago. So for 2 years, I didn't do very much in AA at all. And when I came back full flood, as it were, it was like they were talking Greek. But it took about 3 weeks and then it started to make sense again. It doesn't take long to get back in the swing, however rusty one is with it. So I think the starting point is step 12. I'm extremely skeptical when, from experience, not out of theory, when people who are sober a long time approach me for sponsorship, especially with the phrase, I would like a new experience, please. I want a new experience. And that all sounds very nice. There was a phase where people would devise endlessly novel ways of going through the big book in order to bring about this new experience. And I don't know, the whole thing smacks of a red light district, really. This sort of looking for the cheap thrills and kicks out of the steps rather than with increasingly elaborate systems and methods. And fortunately, two-way prayer seems to have died a death. God, no one's talking about that wretched thing anymore. But yeah, these phases, these tricks, and I think God is much more interested in me going to a meeting and talking to another human being at a meeting than having some special system with the big book and highlighter pens. I think God is more interested in my relationships with people than what colors I use for different things to highlight in the big book. So the starting point, if someone comes to me after many years of AA, so I need a new experience, they say, well, very good. Let's start with step 12. Let's deploy the material you already have. It's my experience that it's very difficult to do the steps, frankly, because one's up against the resistance of the ego. The actual actions are very simple. Again, sometimes a bit of help is needed to untangle oneself. But essentially, it's step 12, I think, very often, once you're second time round, it's step 12, which is the powerhouse. It's that which brings power into one's life. The first now, okay, so the question is, how does someone get through the steps the first time? And I think it's two things. I think the first thing is if you've just had a rock bottom and you still have the bruises on you from being thrown in a police cell, you're going to have a considerable degree of willingness. And that considerable degree of willingness will be sufficient to overcome the resistance of the ego. And you've got the thrill of being in recovery for the first time, surrounded by interesting people. Uh, you're learning so much all the time that uh, that there are energy sources in almost everything you do. Every meeting you go to enlivens and invigorates. Uh, by the time you're around for a few months or years, I'm afraid the shine has worn off and the memory has faded. And the willingness has got to come from some other, the power has got to come from some other source than recent humiliation. And I think it's step 12 which does it. So the absolute core of this is carrying the message in step 12. Service which enables the carrying of the message is very good, but I think on the sliding scale, on the spiritual sliding scale, 1 hour of service work or 1 hour of sponsorship or real 12 step work where you're literally carrying the message to new people, to professionals, or to sponsees or in meetings. 1 hour of that is worth 5 hours of service work, which enables the message to be carried. The high octane stuff is the direct carrying the message, one alcoholic to another, one Al-Anon to another. That's the thing. That's what the whole thing is about. Everything else is preparation for that. Dr. Bob, the old grump, is very good on this topic. He talks about why he does 12-step work. This is on the last page of Dr. Bob's Nightmare, or Nightmare on Dr. Bob Street, as I think of it. What he does is he pays back the people that gave him their time by paying it forward. He doesn't use that terminology, but that's the principle. There is also a moral obligation. If there are people who are in need and I am able to fulfill that need and adequately fitted to fulfill that need, there is the moral obligation. I think the unconscionable thing to do, and I've done it, and this is why it's unconscionable, it burns you up like acid from the inside, is say, I've got everything I want. I'm going to go and live my big life now and F everyone that's coming into the fellowship. Someone else can deal with them. Unconscionable. I've got a strong sense of a moral obligation. And this is one of the reasons why the religion sidetrack is so dangerous. There's nothing wrong with religion. I'm in fact going through, should we say, a religious phase. I hope it's not a phase, but experience suggests that I tend to be hit and miss with religion. But it's not a substitute, it's not an alternative, it's in addition to, not instead of. And I've met a number of people in recovery who've wanted to go down the path either of taking holy orders or ordination in the church. And I suppose there's nothing wrong with it technically, but I tell you, on almost every single occasion, the monks, the nuns, or the ecclesiastical authorities have taken them by the shoulder, turned them round 180 degrees, and given them a little push back towards AA. Say, look, we have enough trouble with our own. Go and deal with your lot. There's work to do back there. That's where God wants you. Go away, come to our services, but just go away. Stop bothering. This is not about, you're making this about you. And I've heard that story again and again and again. And my heart always sinks when someone's accepted for ordination. Ooh, I wonder, what's going on the other side of that conversation. Is it the same going into the treatment industry? I can't tell you, I obviously can't name names, but the number of even circuit speakers who end up in the recovery industry and make it their job and are drunk within a few years. There's something about step 12 where it must be for fun and for free, and it mustn't become one's occupation. If it becomes one's occupation, one changes the relationship with the person one is trying to help. With sponsees, it's remarkable that I keep sponsees, I think, because on occasion I'm pretty candid about difficulties that I have, and I have difficulties. And I'm amazed they're not put off by it, because who wants to be like that at 30 years? I got a message from my friend Tom, sober for a donkey since the 1970s. The other day he said, I'm having a little mental health, mental illness today. And I understand that. I have many days like that. But the point is, one has feet of play, and it's that which enables the message to be carried effectively. It's not the step 12 person being the expert. One isn't an expert. One certainly isn't a professional. One behaves in a professional manner in a sense, but one isn't a professional. The 12 steps have solved all my problems. If they haven't solved it directly, they've solved the problem indirectly by pointing to where the problem can be solved. But for any problem to be solved practically, I need to get spiritually straight first. So most practical problems, frankly, dissolve simply by placing the matter in God's hands and becoming a sheep. So not a man. Have you ever seen a sheep try to manage anything? You ever seen a sheep trying to manage the other sheep, or the sheepdog, or the shepherd? I'm called upon to be a sheep. We are sheeps. I get into trouble when I think I'm more than that. And you tell the world this, they think you're completely mad, but I'm getting better results from being a sheep than I am from trying to be a sheepdog or a shepherd. So I'm just a sheep. And I think step 12 is very much about when you watch sheep in a field, if you've ever watched sheep in a field, which I have, they behave in a way like shoals of fish, or those, is it starlings? There are certain species of bird which fly in these extraordinary flocks which make very strange patterns. You get it with fish as well. And I don't know much about the science of it, but I suspect a lot of it has got to do with looking at what the one next to you is doing and being in line with it. And I think sponsorship is about, a friend of mine said it many years ago. If you want what we did, you do what we do. So you just copy the person. The sponsor says, well, I do this. I think you should do this as well. And you say, okay, I'll do it as well. That's all. Not expert status. I was in a meeting many years ago where a very august member of Alcoholics Anonymous was doing the chair. Very good. It's over a lot of years. And he made two statements during the chair. He made them separate from each other. He didn't put them next to each other, but he deployed both of them like two charges, explosive charges. The first one, he said towards the beginning of the chair, yeah, so AA is really great, but it won't help at all with low self-worth. He just left it there. Oh, no, he said one more thing. He said, but therapy will. That's where I sorted out the low self-worth with therapy. Very good. If that works, good luck to him. So that was the first thing he said. Then about 10 minutes later, he dropped into the conversation, the chair, that he was a therapist who specialized in helping people with low self-worth. Tradition 8, forever non-professional. So even if one goes into one of those related fields, Tradition 8 would suggest don't advertise it in AA from the chair. This is amateurs dealing with amateurs. Back to old grumpy Dr. Bob. You pay it back by paying it forward. There is a moral obligation. It's an insurance against a slip. And I think that works on many levels. First of all, I'm lifted out of self by sponsoring, and self is ultimately the source of drinking again. I could drink again only if I have the thought of drinking and I obey the thought because I am my own higher power. So the more I act in recognition of the fact that the higher power is the higher power, the less likely I am to drink. Secondly, if you work with a lot of people, you'll see some people drinking occasionally, and it's so horrifying what happens. The inexorable decay when someone starts to drink it. It's very rare after people have been sober for a few years. If they slip again, it's very rare, in my experience, for them to come back. If they do come back, it can take years, and sometimes people are never quite the same again. Sometimes they're better the second time, and it really works. My got a friend in Bristol who got sober in 1995, slipped in 2002, something like that. 2000, yes, 2002, and he's now been sober coming up to 21 years, and it's like night and day, the before and after the slip. But that was a 1 day slip. If the alcohol really takes off, it's very difficult to get back. And seeing that firsthand will put the wind up you. Also, I think more alarmingly, sometimes one sees people who slipped after 4 years, 7 years, 8 years, and they come back and they're physically sober and they may make it for a few weeks. But there's this very curious phenomenon where their head knowledge doesn't match where they actually are emotionally, psychologically, spiritually. It's all out of sync. And you see people trying to give it large in meetings with all the knowledge. And it it's ringing hollow. And then you talk to them one to one, you realize why. It's because they had a drink a few weeks ago. And there's the show is there, but there's nothing behind it anymore. The structure which is holding it up has gone, and eventually the facade drops as well. And at that point, people either acquire humility or they drink again. So, and seeing that firsthand, seeing what happens to the mind if you introduce alcohol into it after many years and then drink for a few months and try and come back, putting back some kind of integrity, integrating all the different parts is very, very difficult. And it's so horrific. Um, it makes drinking again almost impossible, frankly. Um, also, step 12 should be enjoyable. Sponsoring people should be enjoyable. When it's not enjoyable, it's because of me. It's not because of them. You can sponsor the most difficult people and have an absolute ball doing it, provided you know how to respond to the difficulties. If I'm finding it emotionally difficult, it's because I haven't yet learned how to handle what is being presented. So there is a lesson there. If I were to get rid of the sponsee because I don't like how I feel when I'm sponsoring them, I would simply have to face the same lesson in the next one. And it's curious how one broadcasts on a particular frequency, and uh, it's as though you attract to you people who contain within them the next lesson on your curriculum. And you'll keep meeting the lesson till it's learnt. Once you've learnt the lesson, that sort of person stops contacting you because you're not available for the dance. So those are the 4 reasons for doing 12-step work: paying it back by paying it forward, moral obligation, insurance against a slip, and it's enjoyable. Uh, Broadening that out, however, um, to expand it, I've already touched on the fact that the fuel is far higher octane than any other sponsorship. The fuel is higher octane or 12-step work when you're talking to a new, a wet drunk or a damp one. Much more useful spiritually to the individual doing the work than anything else. It's also, we're doing the job that only we can do. So it's slotting oneself into the universe at precisely the point at which for which we're fitted. But also, it's the bigger question in step 12. To be in the care of God, I need to be in the service of God. So it really is the fulfillment of the program. A couple of points on sponsorship. My job as a sponsor is to provide the scaffolding for the program. So I help people establish a bit of fellowship, a regular meeting routine, all of that daily program. I take them through the first 9 steps. 10, 11, and 12, really the material in the book speaks for itself. You can be there as a sponsor for questions and answers, but it doesn't require much. It doesn't require teaching or hand holding in the same way. Until questions arise. So one does, I don't see much use in taking people formally through 10, 11, and 12. Get into it, start doing it, and you'll have plenty of questions. Then you answer the questions. As a sponsor, one can help someone apply the principles to matters that arise. And also, I've resumed with sponsees getting people to check in. I hate the term, but check in on a regular basis. Call me, that's what it means, to telephone me. It's like that wretched word outreach. You mean call. Okay, telephone someone. One of the problems with outreach, by the way, is sometimes I know there are fellowships where it's formally one of the things you're supposed to do, but no one really tells people what you're supposed to do in an outreach call. So no one knows what to say, and then the recipient of the call doesn't know what to say back, and the most horrendous confusion arises. Anyway, with sponsees, what I do is I'm getting to call once a week or so, and say what's going on in your life, how are you doing, what are you struggling with, and if anything needs to come out of woodwork, it does. This seems to help with the step work as well. There's the step work, especially steps 1 to 9, is so challenging to the ego. You as the sponsor become the enemy. So if you're having a weekly call, it doesn't hurt at all in terms of helping with the step work, because you retain the position as a human being as well as a sponsor. How to do service in AA. I mean, one could talk for a month of Sundays on that. Some basic principles. Aim to be the best person who has ever done that service in that service role. Doesn't matter if the last half dozen tea makers have been shit. You be the best tea maker. And actually, I'll take the tea making example. A couple of people here will have a laugh at this. I was going to a meeting for a while, very nice meeting. And the tea makers made very nice tea, and they bought very nice biscuits, very tasty biscuits, very tasty tea, lovely. Now, it's a small meeting, about 40 people, 45 people, occasionally 50, but it's it's not like 200. And at any point, when you looked round at the tea making queue, there'd be like 15 people waiting for tea. It would be like a 10-minute wait to get your cup of tea. And I observed from afar and from close, and very often what was going on. There was only one kettle. You need at least 2 kettles, preferably 3 for most meetings, so that you're ready to serve the tea immediately, so no one is waiting. Because they want to get out of the queue and go and do what they're there to do, which is to mix with people and mingle with people rather than stand like a pudding in a queue. So you want to help people get out there and carry the message. So lots of kettles. If there isn't room to store the kettles, you bring a kettle in your little knapsack and then take it home afterwards. The kettles are light. They're not difficult to carry. So that's a fixable thing. Now, at the front of the queue, what was happening is people would get their cup of tea, and the tea makers were lovely, friendly, charming people, and they would chat to the people at the front of the queue. And the chat would go on for as long as the people at the front of the queue who already had their tea wanted to chat, and there was a queue behind. Also, um, there was this, if you're not English, you won't understand this, the tea ceremony. Now, the tea ceremony is not like a Japanese tea ceremony with lots of formality and little prayers and historical things. It's this wretched performance of squeezing the tea bag against the side of the cup and then swirling it round again and then squeezing it again and then looking for a cup to put it in, and then you drip tea all over the surface of the table, and then someone has to go and get a cloth to wipe it up, and then it's the wrong sort of milk. And my father, God rest his soul, born in 1923, said when I was a boy, milk was milk. So some people want milk of the oat, some people want milk of the cow. Then there's too much liquid in the cup to put the milk in, so someone has to carry the cup over to the sink to pour out some of the tea. They bring it back and they put some milk in. By this time, there's now tea on the floor, so someone has to get a different cloth to mop up the tea, and that's stopping the person who's going to the kettle, so they're delayed in bringing the kettle back, which has just boiled. And this is the tea ceremony. And then there's fiddling around where people pick up biscuits, look at them, and put the biscuit back. So the tea person has to spot that this has happened, wait till they've gone, and then dispose of the biscuit, which has been manhandled. No wonder it takes 5 minutes to process a person. Now, obviously, the solution to this, I should have been a time and motion specialist in another life. You have the milk, the biscuits, and the sugar on another table, way over there, so that as soon as the person has got the hot water in their cup, they get the hot water in their cup. The cups are lined up ready with coffee and tea bags of different varieties. You say, what do you want? Peppermint tea. Pour milk and sugar over there. You point them over there, and off they go, the little things. They don't know they're not allowed. They don't know they're allowed to disobey you. So milk and sugar and biscuits over there, just follow. And then the next person is automatically at the front. If you can't get rid of them as the tea person, you call over the person who is at the front, saying, "Can I help you? What can I get?" And then the person who's loitering gets the message. If they don't get the message, you say, "Excuse me, would you be able to move out of the way? I need to serve the person behind you." And at this meeting, they changed how they did the tea. And within 1 week, everyone was getting cups of tea straight away, and there was no queue. And all it required was a tiny bit of observation. The question is, what is going wrong? What can we start doing? What can we do differently? What can we stop doing? And immediately it was turned into the most exemplary tea making operation you could imagine. And that's a silly example in a sense, but it changed the feeling of the meeting. It also serves as a good example to other people. It was a brilliant example. Once it was fixed, it was a brilliant example of how to do tea at a meeting. And that's how all service should be done. When I've got service to do, I turn it around by and large within 24 hours. If the task takes more than 24 hours, I split it into 1 hour chunks and do as many days as is necessary to complete the task. So if you're the secretary of intergroup, the minutes need to go out that day. If the intergroup meeting was at night, they go out first thing the next morning. No fucking around with waiting until 8 minutes before the next intergroup meeting before you pull your finger out and do the job. This is about serving God, is not about having the job title and the brass plate. It's about literally putting it first. If I put AA first and service first and sponsorship first, then I'll have a first class life. And honestly, nothing else then matters. Couple of other things, how to share in meetings. Say something which indicates that I'm an alcoholic or someone who is deeply troubled. That's really helpful. Then they know you're not from the Jehovah's Witnesses. No offense to Jehovah's Witnesses, they do a lot of good work, but we're not Jehovah's Witnesses. at least not exclusive. We might be as well, but we're chiefly alcoholics. So make it clear that you are someone with a profound problem. Say what actions you're taking or what ideas you've adopted. Say what results you're getting. In fellowship after meetings, first of all, and this is such an important thing, Don Pritz would talk about this. He talked about it very well, about how the most important thing is not the meeting, it's the meeting after the meeting at the cafe. Go somewhere cheap so everyone can come. Go somewhere where people, if they can't afford anything, the staff aren't going to turn their nose up or tut or do any of those other little shaming things. Go somewhere where you pay on the way in, not the way out. If you pay on the way out, half the people won't pay, and some mug has to pick up the bill. My friend John and I at Brick Lane, when we used to go to a restaurant where there was a bill at the end, pretty much every week we would have to sub the table's bill about 50 quid because everyone swore blind they paid their share, but it never came up to the total and didn't go anywhere near covering the tip. So every week we would prepare lots of cash, put an extra 50 quid to make sure that the bill is paid, and we are showing staff appreciation by giving a 10% tip. So find somewhere where you pay on the way in. And at the table, make sure everyone is included. Don't talk about stuff that anyone in earshot would not be able to understand or contribute to. Don't talk about anything controversial. Don't talk about politics. If it goes on to talking about golf or films or fashion, I don't know what fashion is. Apparently, it's a thing people talk about. If it goes on to that, fine, let it for a little bit. But the purpose is not to do those things. It's to talk about recovery. There is enough to talk about there. And to make sure everyone is included. If someone is quiet, ask them a question. And when they speak, listen and then ask another question. If a conversation is happening and you're bored, don't start another conversation across it. There are so many little things that if you pay attention, I think so much of step 12 is simply about paying attention and using common sense. If these little things are paid attention to and acted upon, the whole thing becomes a torchlit procession as opposed to chaos. So even those apparently inconsequential things, a lot of service is actually done at fellowship, where people are actively trying to bring people into the room, onto the table, getting them to open up, talk about what's going on, and help bring the experience of the table to bear on the situation, which is literally and figuratively brought to the table. And also, fellowship, don't sit there like don't hog the table, but don't sit there like a potato waiting for other people to entertain you. Find ways of becoming part of the conversation. I think it's in AA that I learned the skills of being in social settings by copying people who knew how to be in social settings. A couple of other things, carrying the message to the outside. Very simple. Put yourself in the shoes of a cynical outsider. Cynical, but essentially good-willed outsider. Don't use jargon and be humble. Don't pronounce on other things. One of the hardest crowds to carry the message to in the outside world is psychiatrists. They deal with, as you can imagine, difficult people, and some of those are alcoholics, and some have gone to AA, and they often have had their patients have had bad experiences in all sorts of ways. One's got to put oneself in their shoes and be very careful what one says about outside issues. In other words, don't say anything about outside issues to lead them through what works in AA and what doesn't work in AA. Doctors as well can be very, very skeptical, again, because they've had patients who said, I went to AA and they carried on drinking or they got worse or something. And the truth is, a lot of doctors and psychiatrists are not fully aware, sometimes not aware at all, that AA is more than just attending meetings. And an image is a very good image if you want to use this in public information is AA is like the AA meetings are like a travel agent. You can go to the travel agent and read the brochure, but it's a far cry from taking the trip. And so when people are just attending meetings, it's like attending a travel agent and expecting to get a suntan. And people understand that, people get that straight away. One point about very new people, you've got to meet them where they are. In that we had a newcomer after a meeting a few weeks ago who was, I think he'd had a drink that day. Get it into your son. He was on his way out of drinking. He was trying to stop, but he'd had a drink that day. And someone at the table said, uh, are you willing to quit drinking for good and for all? You know, they'd heard the line. They thought it sounded very good. Now, there's a time you deploy that, but not with someone that's had a drink. And the bloke equivocated, well, I'm not sure. And this AA member of many years said, well, if you're not willing, then go away and drink some more and come back when you're done. Nul point for that one. Um, uh, uh, you could see him clamming up. Now, he'd come to the meeting because an AA member who we shall call Susan, he had got to know her and she'd suggested he come to a meeting. So I thought I could see what was happening. So I cut across it and said to the bloke, how do you know Susan? And he said two things. He said, first of all, he leant in and said, thank you, by the way. And then he said, well, Susan, I know Susan from da da da. And we spent the next 5 minutes creating a human bond. And then a message could be actually carried. So one's got to be careful with carrying the message to new people. It's not one size fits all. There's got to be observation again. Pay attention to what is in front of you, and ask God to help you. Practicing these principles in all our affairs. There's a frightful danger with this of giving so much information on how to use the traditions, use the concepts, use the contents of the book to excel in outside affairs, whether they be relationships or jobs or activities of other sorts. The danger is that those become objectives in themselves. If you imagine the universe, imagine a universe, and in the universe there is an examination hall, and you're at the desk, and there's paper and pens. And the paper, that's the circumstances of my life. The pen is my character. And those are just givens. And then there are the exam questions. So there are lots of things going on outside in the universe. But in the examination hall, there are some examination questions. And the examination questions the question is always, how am I going to respond to this situation that has arisen, that situation that has arisen? And my examination answer, the answer I write in the script, is my response to that situation. Now, the outcomes of those situations are not the point. I'm not examined on those. I'm not examined on the situations themselves. I'm not examined on the quality of the paper or the quality of the ink. What I'm examined on is the answer that I write on the script, which is my response to those situations. The great examiner, which if you haven't figured out by now is the higher power, is interested only in how I respond to those situations, my attitudes and my actions, not the outcomes. So I must not be concerned with my circumstances, the paper, my character, the pens, the situations out there. I must be concerned only effectively with the practice of the principles in those things. This is why personal ambition has no place. The only ambition should be to practice the principles in all my affairs and carry the message. Those are the only legitimate ambitions. The ambition is not to get a life or get a big life. The life I get will be the life I get based on trying to do God's will. And it may be a small life or it may be a big life. I might be important. I might be unimportant. And I'll finish on this. In A Christmas Carol, Scrooge talks about eliminating people who are useless in society, by decreasing the surplus population. And one of the spirits reflects this back to him later on, and effectively says, you look at people like Tiny Tim or all these the other sort of pathetic creatures, Dickensianly pathetic creatures in the story, and says effectively in the light of God, those people might be much more valuable in God's eyes than you are. You might be the surplus population, Scrooge. So the measure of my life is not what it looks like on the outside. I mean, just FYI, it's not bad. It's all right. But that's not the point. The point is, am I growing towards God or towards self? That's it. So I'm going to stop there, Jason. I've got about 10 minutes for questions if there are any.
Anne's got a hand up, Tim.
Okay, so Anne, would you like to ask your question?
Hi, Tim. What do you do when you have a sponsee who doesn't do what they're told?
Very good. The reason I'm laughing, sometimes people say, I've got a sponsee that stopped calling me. What do I do? Which is a variation of the same question. And the answer is, you can't answer a phone that's not ringing. There is nothing you can do. There's nothing to do with a phone that is not ringing. You can only answer a ringing phone. It's what my friend said. If you want what we do, you do what we did. If you don't want to do it, find someone whose instructions you want to follow. End of conversation. Very simple. There are variations of that, but that's the essence of that. Any more questions? You can put questions in the chat as well if you. Oh, here's lovely juicy one. Let's have a look. If a sponsor has written inventory and is to do the 5th step at the weekend and has relapsed, do you still do the 5th? I understand that Dr. Bob didn't stay sober until he made amends. Very, very good question. I don't think relapse comes out of the blue. It's not a common thing to happen, but it is a particular phenomenon. Relapsing between the end of step 4, beginning of step 5. And it's usually because there's something nasty in the woodwork. There's a skeleton in the cupboard. There's a fly in the ointment. But everyone's got some of those. That's not the whole reason. That's not the whole thing. Normally, there's a pattern of not following the program the daily program in all sorts of ways for days or weeks or even months before the relapse. So I do two things. We look back at the first 4 steps and say, where are the gaps? Because there's a gap in step 1. There's a gap in step 3. There hasn't been a fundamental surrender to staying sober, come what may. We then look at what the person's daily program looks like. So are all of the elements in place in terms of fellowship, meeting, service? If they're in place, the person just won't drink. Sometimes there's another addiction, a sex addiction or food usually, which is acting up, occasionally gambling. It's usually sex or food, or stalking some ex. That will need to be brought out into the open. But essentially, once you've done that basic groundwork to see where the gap is, you carry on. There's no point in going back, and I don't think there's any point in putting them through a very laborious step 1 process. You know, do you drink too much? Can you stop on your own? Do you think AA will work? Well, let's get on with it. Done. Suze, would you like to come in with your question?
Hello? No.
Yes, we can hear you.
Oh, good. Tim, would you, if somebody doesn't do all the things you tell them to do, would you end the sponsorship relationship, or you let them go until they work it out? Or?
Well, it depends. It depends how much, because it's rarely just that. Normally there are shenanigans as well. So you've got to deal with the shenanigans. But essentially, yes, I'm much less inclined to just say, well, that's the end of it forever. What I will say is, yes, when you're willing to do it, just, you know, start doing it, give me a call. Because often it takes people a long to, let's say it's step 4 or step 8, it's usually somewhere in there that it breaks down. Sometimes it's step 12, sometimes people refuse. I knew someone many years ago I sponsored who's very, very good. He loved his steps. I think he used to say, my steps, I'm doing my steps. And that's what, when someone says my in front of the steps, question it. They don't belong to you. You are giving yourself to them. They're not something, it's not your little private project. He loved doing his steps, and then he wanted to do the traditions and the concepts, and did Course in Miracles and became a Course in Miracles teacher and all that. But he wouldn't do sponsorship. He wouldn't sponsor people. There was a fundamental resistance to sponsoring people. And at around 19 years, he relapsed and hasn't been able to come back. It really is a very critical question. With the unwillingness, so the unwillingness in that case was in step 12. Sometimes it's in step 4 or step 8. If you boot them completely with no entrance back in, the danger is that it will take them another 6 months to get to that precise point of resistance with someone else. Because they'll reach the same point of resistance with the next person. It doesn't necessarily help. So I usually give people a way back unless there are behaviors which essentially represent a fundamental breach of trust or a breach of ordinary human etiquette. So there are lines that can be crossed. I'm not going to list them. Some more questions. Angelo.
Hi, thank you, Tim. What would you suggest is the earliest point to maybe suggest sponsoring to a sponsee?
I think it varies from fellowship to fellowship. There are some fellowships where there are so few people able to sponsor. As soon as you've done step 5, you can start bringing people through step 1 and just stay ahead of them. I think in AA, you should be some way into step 9 because AA is a big fellowship with a lot of people available to sponsor. Get into step 9, make some amends. It shouldn't be far after step 5 that you're making amends. If it's a long time after, it's something that's gone horribly wrong. But get some amends under your belt, and then you've got a full range. You can talk about all 12 steps to some extent. Then, so that's it. I think that's a good point. So some more questions. Stuff about teapots. Yeah, so someone who is, I won't read that whole message, it's quite a personal one, but saying they can't or will not accept the stupidity of people. Oh God, I identify with that. Technical term for this in AA is having a resentment, except it's a resentment against the whole of humanity. The only answer I know, I get myself painted into corners where I can't see a way out. And what I've had to do is say to myself, I'm just gonna, I need my mind to be opened completely. I need to drop everything I think I know. And plonk myself in the middle of AA, find the strongest group, find the strongest people in the strongest group, say, give me things to do, and then you do them and you keep your mouth shut and just do the things. And to treat what I have to do on a regular basis is treat my mind as a source of bad information. That is all. I can't think my way out of bad thinking. I have to act my way out of bad thinking. Someone says, do you set a time limit on the amount of time a sponsee has to do a step? I tend to break each step down into constituent parts so that if someone is doing I suggest 1 hour of step work every day, on working days, 2 hours or more on non-working days. Get up early, do the step work before anyone else in the house is up. Then every day it will get done. If you can't get up early enough, you're going to bed too late, go to bed earlier. Netflix is not going to go anywhere. And I take people through in such a way that if they do that, there will be step work to deliver on a daily basis. So deliver the work on a daily basis. If they don't deliver it for a few days, they don't deliver it for a few days. No one does it perfectly. Jason, you got a question?
That's okay. Can ask you offline.
It's gone again. Okay. Okay, someone has asked, do you ask sponsees to do step work the way you currently think it's best to be done? Or do you I give okay, so the program is not a static thing. I'm a big old mess because of AA and Al-Anon and all sorts of other resources that I've used. So frankly, I don't have a particularly orthodox, it's big book, but there's other stuff from the world of recovery in there as well. And there's my experience over the last 30 years. It was 31 that I've been since I first joined AA. So almost 31 years of experience. It changes. So I give people the program as I'm currently practicing it because I redo the steps on a regular basis. I'm giving them what I'm currently doing, not what I did 20 or 30 years ago. Time limit specifically on step 4, the same thing. You give them the thing to do, they spend an hour doing it, they come back with the results. You can't set a time limit on the step per se. I've had people finish the whole of step 4 in about 6 weeks by doing an hour or 2 a day, sometimes more. But that's rare. You see, the thing is, step 4 involves 2 things. It involves unscrambling the thinking behind the resentments, getting out, and then on the basis of that, getting over the resentments with the help of prayer, page 66, 67, and then the real inventory starts on page 67. It can take, if people are very, very scrambled, it can take 6 months to get to that point, because people just can't think straight. They can't say a sentence with words that mean anything. A very common, I'll give you an example, very common thing that people will say. So, you know, I'm upset at Susan, Susan. I'm upset because she doesn't respect me. Personal relations, I want her to respect me. What does that mean? What did she do? And they say, well, I don't know, she just didn't respect me. It can take 6 weeks to get behind that to the thing which the person did. Susan gave her a funny look in the corridor. That's what it was. Learning to use words that mean something to describe events that actually took place is an amazingly laborious lesson for a lot of people. You cannot force this. You can't possibly do a moral analysis of yourself as required by page 67 if you can't literally describe what happened in the room in which you were present. Language is used, I don't think it's any different now than it was in the past. You read Bacon and he's completely impenetrable because the language is so fuzzy and fluffy at times. So the 16th century is no different than the 21st century. Same Ralph Waldo Emerson, unreadable because it's so abstract. And people's step 4 start off like Ralph Waldo Emerson, very poetic, but meaning absolutely nothing for the most part. People have got to learn to use language. If that takes 6 months, if that takes a year, I'm afraid that's how long it takes. But there is huge value in being able to go from I'm pissed off at Susan, but she doesn't respect me, to I'm pissed off at Susan, but she gave me a funny look in the corridor. Because then there's a bump when you come down to the reality that you're not pissed off because of this grand thing. You're pissed off because of a look. And we can't even be sure if she gave you that look. How do you know she get it after the event? Can you prove she gave you that look? She might have had indigestion. You can't even talk about it until you get to the facts. So step 4 is about, unfortunately, with the best will in the world, you want to do it quickly. But if you skim over that, if you allow a step 4 to be written where it's all just flowery language, you know, peppered with all of these therapy words like, you know, trauma and abandonment and narcissistic and toxic and holding the space and all of those things. There's a marginal benefit in getting some of the secrets out in step 5, but the whole structure, the whole fallacious structure of the fantasy world is still there. So I think it's best to do it properly than to scoot through it out of fear. If people are surrendered, they won't drink through that process of doing it properly. And someone says, how often do you meet with your sponsor? My sponsor's in Texas. I'm in London. So I tend to see him I go over a couple of times a year. Which is why, by the way, I probably shouldn't say this, but I'm going to. I had a sponsor who lived in Chelsea. Now, if you're not in London, Chelsea is always very nice there. But public transport is not great in certain parts of Chelsea. It's a 15-minute walk to the nearest tube station. The tube line doesn't really go anywhere. And I live in East London. And it would take them a good hour to get from their house to my home group. And every week they complained bitterly at the indignity and an injustice of coming to my home group, especially as they said, she said, but the Uber takes almost as long as the tube. I mean, it looks like I'm going to have to take the tube to get there. As if this was going to promise, oh, well, in that case, I couldn't possibly ask you to take public transport. I'm not making this up, you know, this is actual conversation. They got well. That's how the story ended. They're very good. We have a laugh about But my sponsor says, come to Houston. So I can say, oh, okay, there we go. So I go. What are the content of these exchanges? Well, I speak to him a lot. What's the content? I talk to him. Then he talks back. It's not formal. With my sponsees, it's a very similar thing. I can talk every week and, you know, how are you doing? What's going on? What are you struggling with? And the important information is almost invariably contained in the cracks between what they're saying. There'll be a turn of phrase which is far more revealing than the actual content the person is bringing to the table. If you pay attention and observe carefully, you'll hear what you need to hear to proceed with the person. So I think the message of this whole thing is pay attention, and then you'll be absolutely fine. That's it on the questions. So Jason, do you want to close us off?